introduce this year's Backhouse Lecture, to be delivered by Jackie Leach Scully. The lecture asks the question, what might disability, difference, and normality mean for friends in the 21st century? Let us acknowledge that we are meeting on the land of the Kaurna people and pay respect to their elders. I'll start a little talking about the lecture itself before introducing Jackie. This is one of a series of annual lectures which began in 1964 when Australia Yearly Meeting of the Religious Society of Friends was first established. The lecture is named after James Backhouse, who travelled with his companion George Washington Walker throughout the Australian colonies from 1832 to 1838. Backhouse and Walker were English Quakers who came to Australia with a particular concern for social justice, having connections to social reform movements in the early colonies as well as in Britain. Backhouse and Walker planned to record their observations and make recommendations for positive change where needed. Detailed observations were made of all the prisons and institutions visited by Backhouse and Walker. Their reports, submitted to local as well as British authorities, make recommendations for legislative reform. Many of the changes they initiated resulted in improvements to the health and well-being of convicts, Aboriginal people, and the general population. As a naturalist and botanist, James Backhouse is remembered also for his detailed accounts of native vegetation, which were later published. James Backhouse was welcomed by isolated communities and friends throughout the colonies. He shared all his concern with social justice and encouraged others in their faith. And a number of Quaker meetings began as a result of the visits of those two. And about our lecturer, Jackie Leach Scully has been involved with Quakers for over 40 years, first in the United Kingdom, then Switzerland, again in the UK, and now in Australia. She has occupied a variety of roles too, from attender to member to clerk of Switzerland Yearly Meeting, and served on more committees she cares to remember. In 2002, she gave the annual Swarthmore Lecture to Britain Yearly Meeting, Playing in the Presence, Genetics, Ethics and Spirituality. Jackie first trained as a molecular biologist and for a number of years researched the mechanisms of cancer and neurodegenerative disorders, but then became more interested in the ethical and legal issues raised by contemporary medicine. At the University of Basel, she helped to establish the first interdisciplinary bioethics centre in Switzerland. And at Newcastle University in the UK, was Executive Director of the Policy, Ethics and Life Sciences Research Centre. In 2019, she moved to Sydney to lead the Disability Innovation Institute at the University of New South Wales, where she is also Professor of Bioethics. Disability has shaped her family, career, personal and professional life, and her engagement with faith and spirituality. Now making her home in Australia, she hopes to share some dissident disability thinking with Australian friends. Many of us Quakers like to think of ourselves as dissidents sometimes, but I fear that I and probably others have conventional attitudes to issues around disability. So we particularly look forward to hearing what you have to say, Jackie. Friends, it's our custom not to applaud at the end of a lecture, but instead we will return to silence for a time, and the silence will be broken by Jackie handshaking with me. A very warm welcome to you, Jackie.
Okay. Good evening, friends. And first things first, am I heard at the back? Am I audible? That's great. Thank you. Some slides may appear. I'm talking this evening about God's ways, not our ways, a dissident Quaker response to disability. I'd like to start first with an acknowledgement in which I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which most of this lecture was written, the Guringai and Darug people, and the land on which it's being given, the Kaurna people, and to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people who contribute to our work of creating and sharing knowledge. Now, as it happens, today, the 8th of July, is James Backhouse's birthday. He's born on the 8th of July in 1794, and the Australian National Biography has this to say about him, bearing in mind that this was written in 1966, so some of the language used we might not use today. It says, his genial good nature and shrewd common sense remained agreeable memories to his hosts. A strict Quaker with peculiar plainness of dress, and I hope he would approve this evening, dress and profession, he had a broad tolerance and ability to befriend and mix with everyone. With an understanding freed from pretensions and outward signs, he saw with a scientist's precision the inner core of real religion in heathen Hottentot, Australian Aboriginal and colonial convict. In this lecture, I want to talk about disability and dissidence. And although focusing on the meaning of disability and impairment for Quakers today, I'm also asking a couple of broader questions. How should the Religious Society of Friends in Australia in the 21st century respond to embodied difference and variation? And what sort of different or even dissident thinking should we call on in order to know how to respond in faithful ways? I think it's helpful if you know where I'm going through the course of the lecture. I'll be talking about different ways of thinking about disability, mentioning a couple of the distinct models available. Then I'll be briefly describing some of the scriptural and theological attempts to make sense of disability. And then I'll raise the relationship of advances in reproductive medicine, particularly in prenatal selection, which is my field, to disability. And it's these advances in reproductive medicine that I think make it really so important that we clarify for ourselves the meaning of disability. And in the final part of the lecture, I'll be looking at disability through the lens of Quaker testimony and end by asking how we can discern what it might mean to take a dissident Quaker approach to disability. I'm aware, as I said to somebody earlier today, that this is a tough gig. It's at the end of a long day and after supper, so I will do my very best to keep you awake and interested for the course of the lecture. By dissident thinking, I mean thinking that challenges the taken for granted and easy assumptions, and thinking that's open to new light. And I've chosen to use the language of dissidence rather than dissent, which we may be more familiar with, because that language of dissent is so closely tied to the history of dissenting church groups. And to my mind, dissidence isn't about church policy, and it also carries a stronger sense of of action as well as opinion. That's thinking and acting differently. The disability has been part of my life for as long as I can remember, in different ways over time. And in fact, my exposure to disability began right at the moment I arrived into the world. My mother had what we would now call a congenital birth anomaly. She had only one arm. She'd been born that way. And growing up with a one-armed mother meant that I took it as quite normal that people could vary in this way. So that says something about difference and abnormality being some things that we are not used to, rather than some things that of their own are things to be feared or be worried about. Then at the age of 8, I contracted meningitis, which some of you will know is an inflammation of the meninges, which is the membrane around the brain. And this was some years ago. Even today, bacterial meningitis, which was the form I had, has a mortality rate of between 5 and 10%. And it leaves around 20% of the people who suffer it with lasting health consequences, particularly, as in my case, sensory neural deafness. So I lost all the hearing in my right ear and the majority of my hearing in the left ear. My parents were grateful to have a live child to take home at all. So I think they didn't at first realise just what a difference that this would make to my life. As a deaf child, I would have a very different life than otherwise. And then in 2015, unexpectedly, I fell acutely and severely ill with a viral infection that ultimately turned out to destroy my liver. So that I needed a transplant of a donor liver, in just a condition I live with still. And my professional life has also given me insights into disability. I was originally a scientist, and been mentioned, a molecular biologist, before I went into the field of bioethics. Bioethics, just to be clear, is a very broad discipline. It's concerned primarily with ethical and moral issues in medicine, advances in medicine, in the life sciences in general. From the early 2000s onwards, for reasons I'll come on to later, my research work began to deal more and more closely with questions related to disability. So these now 6 decades of personal experience inevitably mean that I've spent a lot of time trying to make sense of disability and impairment and disabling chronic illness. This making sense of disability and illness, not just professionally as an ethicist, but also as a Quaker. I come from a family background that was very mixed and hybrid in terms of race, culture, and religion. I'm a baptized Catholic, a confirmed Anglican, and eventually wandered my way towards the Religious Society of Friends when I was in my late teens, and I've been with you ever since. So my making sense of disability has drawn on friends and colleagues from across the belief spectrum, who have also grappled in a serious way with questions of disability and difference and belief. And I want to acknowledge their help. Some of them are watching online this evening, their help in thinking these issues through. So my first section is thinking about disability. And I'll start by saying it's actually quite difficult to think about disability. For one thing, disabilities are very diverse, and any concept of disability, we should be a couple on from there. Keep going. Keep going. There we are. Right, okay, we've landed. Good. Disabilities are very diverse. Any concept of disability sometimes has to bring together everything from paraplegia to various genetic syndromes, mental illnesses, sensory impairments, disablement that results from chronic illness, what follows an accident, conditions that are present from birth and those that develop later on, impairments that are age-related, and disabilities that are stable, and others that are progressive, and others that fluctuate from day to day. So that's one problem. A second is that there's almost no neutral language available to us to talk about disability. If you think about it, what we have are words like disability, disorder, malfunction, invalid, deformed, disfigured. All of that type of language makes a very clear judgment and a very clear negative judgment, even before we start to have the discussion in the first place. And finally, what you might call our cultural repertoire of knowledge about disablement. That's the stories and the anecdotes and the background knowledge of what it is actually like to live with various kinds of disability. That knowledge is very sparse. Now, in most of the world, science, and particularly medicine, has taken over from religion in providing what you might think of as a meaning for phenomena like illness and disability. The explanations that they provide are often referred to nowadays as the medical model of disability. And in that model, in that way of thinking, disability is a defect or a deficit. It's some kind of deviation from a biological or physiological or medical norm or standard. Within the last 50 years or so, there have been some alternative ways of thinking about disability. These are often described as social or sometimes social relational or sometimes hybrid models. And what they have in common is the idea that disability isn't a thing in itself, but it emerges out of the interaction between a person's body, either physical or mental, and the world in which they live. Different versions of social relational models differ in exactly how they describe the interaction between the body and the world and the kind of problems that they see arising out of mismatches between expectations of how bodies are and the way the world is designed. That's the key idea, is the interactional one. And where the medical approach assumes that deviating from a biological norm inevitably leads straight to disablement of some kind or other, social relational approaches argue that the problem of disability, if it is one, comes just as much from these mismatches in the interaction between the body and the world. Neither of these perspectives, medical or social, pays much attention to theological or spiritual views on disability. So they're not much help. In fact, I want to suggest that no single model or approach can actually explain a phenomenon like disability in its entirety. Instead, we ought to be aware that different approaches will be more or less useful, more or less appropriate in particular contexts. The medical model will get me a diagnosis and access to treatment, and also a diagnostic label today may be the gateway to additional social care, educational supports, that kind of thing. A social relational approach will help me argue for adaptations in my workplace. This workplace is not matching the needs of my body. And it may also shore up my sense of self-worth if it helps me to feel that it's society and not my body, myself, that is to blame for my predicament. Dissident thinking, I would argue, stands back from all of these. It sees their explanatory value, but also their flaws and their limitations. And I think as Quakers, we start from an understanding that the person with disability always also holds that of God, and so is always, as anybody else, more than any explanatory framework. The next section is about theologies of disability. In this part, I want to look briefly, I promise, at attempts to comprehend disability and chronic illness that have been made by past and contemporary. Onward, one. Okay, never mind. That have been made by past and contemporary theology. In the published version of the lecture, the book which will be available to you in due course, I spend a lot more time on scriptural sources. This doesn't mean that I think that the Bible is the only source of spiritual insight or that Christianity is the one true religion, but I am interested in how past and contemporary interpretations of those texts have influenced so heavily centuries in our culture of thinking about the meaning of disability and illness. I also, in that book and in this lecture, use a lot of God language. It's because it's what I'm used to, and it tends to be fairly succinct. If any of you have problems this evening or in the reading with that kind of language, feel free to interpret it into something that you're more comfortable with. In this section, I just want to make 2 points fairly briefly. First, anyone looking to the scriptures for a straightforward account of the meaning of disability is doomed to disappointment, or perhaps just as bad, doomed to find exactly what they expect to see. The biblical accounts of disability are diverse, they're inconsistent, they're often contradictory, and they demonstrate that the understandings of disability at various points in antiquity have been more sophisticated sometimes and more nuanced than many of the later users of the scriptures have been prepared to acknowledge. In the book, I also discuss the New Testament healing narratives in some detail. Again, because the conventional understanding, which is that they're a vehicle for Jesus to demonstrate his divine nature by curing illness or even by bringing the dead back to life, has so deeply influenced how we think about disability and illness. When these miracles, these stories of these miracles were presented to me as a disabled child, they carried the very clear message that from Jesus' point of view, I was a priority candidate for repair. And that unlike the other kids around me, I was not good enough as I was. But I think if you look at those accounts harder, they're rarely as straightforward as they appear. Relatively few of the healing narratives are actually simply about the removal of a physical or mental condition. And in the published version, I just offer an interpretation in which they have more to do with restoring people who have been excluded from their community to the heart of their community. And that's a point I'll come back to later. That's the scriptures. The later Christian theological tradition has considered disability and chronic illness through 2 main lenses: how disability relates to the problem of evil and the place of the disabled person in the created world. Now, for most people writing on this through the centuries, it has seemed obvious that disability necessarily involves suffering and pain and disadvantage. And so they've taken disability and the suffering that they assume as a prime example of the problem of evil in the world. Theodicy is the technical term for the various attempts to answer the question of why, if God is omnipotent and benevolent, evil exists at all. And possibly the most influential attempt comes from the writing of St. Augustine of Hippo in the early centuries in Common Era, writing about original sin. You're all familiar with that idea, I'm sure. According to this theory, it's because of the original sin of Adam and Eve, who misused their free will to disobey God, that evil entered the world and suffering became part of human life. And this account has had enormous influence, effectively shaping the Western Church's policy on why bad things happen for centuries. There's an alternative theodicy that was developed by another early church figure, Irenaeus, living a little while before Augustine. His idea was that evil and suffering are necessary for, in a way, developmental reasons, i.e. that we grow spiritually by encountering evil or by suffering. This is what the theologian John Hick referred to as the world as a veil of soul making. Now, in some ways, this sits a lot more easily with us in the 21st century than the Augustinian idea of original sin. We, Quakers and others, are far less comfortable with the language of sin, let alone the idea of it, and happier to think of challenges as being character building, or that people who have had to struggle have learnt useful lessons. There are a lot of problems with both of those models, and I'll discuss those more in the book. But what I want to suggest this evening is that neither of those stories, of those accounts, is particularly helpful to people or their families who are directly experiencing disability and trying to make sense of it in their lives. There are some contemporary theologians who make an interesting contrast with this. They've been much less concerned with theodicy and what you might call the spiritual mechanics, the cogs and wheels of why suffering happens. More concerned with how people with disabilities fit into our understanding of a world that's created and maintained by God. And in particular, how should we respond to those people who come into the world with disabilities, who are born with sometimes catastrophically disabling differences? We haven't got there yet, but never mind. I'm going to talk now about disability in reproductive technology. It was this question of why do people are born with disabilities, that brought my professional and my religious meaning-making together. As I said earlier, the disability eventually became part of my work as a bioethicist. And that's because medicine is actually centrally concerned, if you think about it, with disability. Because much of medicine is really about preventing or making better those conditions that end up by being disabling. The emergence of selective reproductive technologies in the late 1980s onwards now really began to highlight this. I think you're all familiar with the way that today's medical technologies offer a historically unprecedented degree of control over whether and when we have children. And broadly speaking, societies like Australia are accepting of the use of contraception and abortion under certain circumstances, and also that people who have difficulty conceiving should have access to assisted reproductive technologies. So things like in vitro fertilization, IVF, test tube babies, egg and sperm donation, embryo donation, surrogacy, and so on. What's much more ethically controversial are the technologies that enable us to select the kind of child we want to have. These are methods of prenatal testing and screening, ultrasound, blood tests that can identify genetic anomalies. They've become a routine part of antenatal care in wealthier countries of the world, like Australia. Prenatal screening programs are offered with the aim of providing prospective parents with more information about their future child than they would have had, and therefore, in principle, with more options. In practice, at the moment, in most cases, the choice is between continuing with the pregnancy or terminating it, because there are relatively few conditions that can be identified prenatally for which we have any kind of treatment that would prevent that condition appearing at birth. Now, I believe that these biomedical technologies are the result of our God-given drive to search constantly for ways to make people's lives better. But what they also do is hand us enormous power that has to be used with care. Being able to select prenatally before the appearance into the world against disability and impairment raises huge moral challenges. And some of those have brought bioethicists and disability activists into confrontation. It's been disability activists and their families who, over the last half century or so, have driven the genuine advances in equality and inclusion for people with disability. And the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is emblematic of this. But that wouldn't have happened without decades of working for incremental changes in attitude towards disability. But although their human rights are better acknowledged than ever before, disabled people are still excluded and discriminated against at all levels of society. And that's a phenomenon we usually call ableism. every report you choose to look at, whether it's about health or employment or education or poverty or incarceration, whatever, will always show people with disability somewhere near the bottom of the pile. And my work with feminist groups and with colleagues in the First Peoples Disability Network have reminded me that at the very bottom of the pile will be women with disabilities and people, First Nations people with disability. So it's in this ambivalent context, partly good news about inclusion and partly bad news about lack of progress, that biomedical science is developing capabilities that for the first time in human history can reliably identify some impairments long before birth. Then the concern for bioethicists like me isn't really about the morality of abortion per se. That's still discussed, but since it's legal in so many countries, it's not really a hot issue. It's about the risk that prenatal testing becomes routine and unthinking. It's so routine that we stop noticing that it actually involves moral choices, and that the capacity to control who comes into the world ultimately reduces the already fairly low societal tolerance for different kinds of human variation. Now, many disability activists and scholars feel quite strongly that any form of prenatal reproductive selection to avoid disability is an expression of hostility to disabled people, and it runs counter to that goal of increasing acceptance and tolerance and inclusion of difference. They argue that prenatal selection to prevent disability is flatly eugenic. It's just the latest step in the long history of attempts to somehow improve the quality, in some vague way, of the population by getting rid of or preventing the birth of disabled people. That eugenic eradication of people with disability and some mental illnesses reached its nadir, if you like, during the Nazi Third Reich in the mid-20th century. Others, including myself, believe that there are situations where selection can be the appropriate response. This is where disabling conditions have so severe an impact, cause such a degree of suffering, that only a sadist, really, would want to remove the option of preventing or avoiding them. I think that what is problematic here, what's discriminatory, is not the technology itself, but the desire for the technology to aid easy, or at least unambiguous choices. One thing it's important to emphasize is that even if prenatal screening were to result in no babies with any kind of genetic or congenital condition ever coming into the world, there would still be plenty of disabled people around. Only about 10% of disabilities are detectable prenatally. The vast majority of disability comes about as a result of aging or accident or illness. In fact, I've commented before that with my bioethicist colleagues, they tend to be very uninterested in the specifics of disability. They like talking very generally and broadly about disability as if it was all the same thing. And then when they hit basically 55, 60 onwards, they suddenly become really interested in the details of little impairments and small disabling conditions. Now, I've concentrated on techniques of genetic selection because that's the area I know about, but also because the power that they offer is so new that it ought to make us pause and take a deep breath and consider what we really think about disability and difference. And this process of discernment is a familiar part of Quaker faith and practice, and it's what I'm going to talk about next. I want to use the dissident lens offered by Quaker testimonies to suggest how friends today are called to respond to disability and impairment in ways that align with our commitment to the inward light. I'm going to highlight 3 themes or areas of challenge. How do we respond to embodied diversity? How do we live as creatures that are vulnerable and dependent and not in control of what happens to us? And how can we be just and inclusive community? So first of all, being embodied. All of us Disabled, non-disabled, or like are embodied creatures. We don't do anything without a body. For most conventional views of disability, the normal body is taken as a starting point for all thinking about disability. Disability is in comparison to something called a normal body. The disabled body is defined in terms of its defects compared to the norm. So in this perspective, disability is always a matter of falling short of an ideal. And people are sorted into two groups: normal people and those whose bodies deviate so much that they cross the line over difference into disability. I think dissident thinking demands that we step outside this system of binary classification altogether. And a different starting point would be the fact that every person is born with a set of limits. These play out differently according to the context in which they live, the environment, their country, their family, their biography. And these limits variously hamper or help their chances of living a good and flourishing life. The theologian Deborah Beth Creamer, who I write about a little in the book, has written extensively on disability. And she is particularly critical of this prevalent but usually unchallenged idea that to be limited in any way is a negative thing. A corollary of this belief that limits are always negative is that the fewer constraints or limits a person experiences, the better. And I think that it's then quite a short step to thinking that the fewer limits you have, the closer you are to perfection. And in religious language, the more like a perfect God one might be. And I think this idea has contributed to that sense I've already mentioned, that disabled bodies are always not quite as good as others. But physical and mental limits are integral and unavoidable aspects of the human condition. And limits are not solely about closing off possibilities. They can also be productive and generative. Any artist will tell you that the constraints inherent in the medium of creation are essential to the creative process. Watercolors and oil paints produce very different pieces of work, and they engage very different forms of creativity because of the distinctive properties of the two media. Ironically, I think a total absence of limits, a total absence of constraints doesn't mean complete freedom. It means a total absence of any kind of properties. In other words, it's a void. It's a state of sterility and death, not creativity. Now, this isn't the same argument as saying, disabled people have to be particularly creative in devising ways to overcome their physical or mental limits. That can be true. What I'm saying is it's something more fundamental about the need for limits as the conditions of possibility for creativity or indeed for existence at all. So here, though, I want to add a note of caution. Rejecting the binary classification of disabled and non-disabled is one thing. Kind of ricocheting to the other extreme and saying all disability is just a neutral variation is quite another. Disability advocates have sometimes suggested that to avoid being eugenic, to avoid being discriminatory, you have to welcome all forms of physical difference without reservation, because all differences are equally valuable parts of human diversity. It's a kind of let 100 flowers blossom model. I think that this is very wrong, and I'm happy to engage with you tomorrow in the discussion if you disagree with me. Even if it's true that many apparently severe disabilities would be much less problematic if society was more inclusive, nevertheless, they will always remain conditions for which no amount of changed attitudes or greater accessibility will eradicate all the disadvantages. In a more disability-friendly world, a person who has the genetic condition osteogenesis imperfecta, which is commonly known as brittle bone syndrome, might be much more able to access education, to travel to work, to have a social life, if they were able to access buildings and public transport and so on better. These would all be improvements. but the propensity for fractures and the fragility and the pain and the limitations on life and the medical consequences would still be there. And this is what makes it impossible to say sweepingly, I welcome the diversity that is disability, in quite the same way as in which we might say, I welcome diversity in race, or I welcome diversity in gender. It's a different thing. In fact, I'm going to suggest that saying disabilities are neutral variations, or saying we have to accept the disabilities that God sends us, is paradoxically pretty much equivalent to saying that all disability is terrible and should be eradicated. And the reason I'm saying that is because in both cases, what is happening is a refusal to engage with disability in its reality, to do the hard yards of understanding it, and not sidestepping the responsibility to make judgments about it. Both of those, let every disability come versus get rid of all disability, are fundamentally lazy. They're lazy thinking. And I realized as I was writing this that as an academic, lazy thinking comes quite high on my list of mortal sins. The Quaker response to diversity of embodiment or anything else is rooted in our testimony of equality. That testimony doesn't concern itself with particular characteristics or abilities, but with the recognition that the Spirit of God dwells in every person. Calls for equality are often mistaken for the claim that everyone is the same, or even that everyone should be treated the same. But to practice true equality is to be able to hold in mind at one and the same time that which is common to all of us, and the particularities that are unique to individuals and that shape their distinctive strengths and capabilities and disabilities and vulnerabilities. Equality doesn't mean ignoring genuine differences, either through a misplaced sense of kindness or a fear of conflict. And I think Quakers can be particularly prone to the latter. Equality is the bedrock of knowing that the inward light, like love, is not measured out differently for different people. We're all equal in the sight of God. And this knowledge is the ground of our commonality as people. And it gives us the security from which to engage fully with embodied difference. The next section is on being vulnerable and dependent and not in control. Now, for many people, the defining feature of disabled people is not that their body has an unusual form, but that they are dependent on the care of others. For much of modern Western history, the people who've been taken seriously, the people who've been taken to matter, are those who have been considered to be autonomous. And autonomy is part of a complicated tangle of ideas about being independent, being in control, being invulnerable, able to determine for yourself how you want your life to go, and able to take the necessary steps to make all that happen. And so the argument goes, disabled people are not like that. They're not autonomous. They can't do this stuff by themselves. This neat model ignores the fact that even able-bodied and healthy adults all live within very complex and very sticky webs of dependencies. Our culture recognizes that the very young, the very old, and those who are sick are highly dependent, but it chooses not to acknowledge that few of us would survive if we had to provide entirely everything for ourselves that we need. The most independent person will nevertheless need food, which usually means somewhere like a shop where they can buy it, therefore food producers, therefore supply chains, therefore transport, fuel, some form of economy. These needs, these dependencies are so universal, they're not even seen as dependencies, at least not until they disappear, as in a pandemic. In reality, this much vaunted ideal of total independence and invulnerability is a delusion. We live in groups because as individuals, we need the help of others to live at all. I don't actually think I have to push this idea very hard with Quakers. Last night we were listening to the summary of epistles, and we heard so many of them draw on the idea of Ubuntu, that I am because you are, that people are because other people are here. So I think we all recognize this idea very easily. I cannot tell you the effort it is to convince some of my professional colleagues to take this idea seriously. The theologian Kathy Black has suggested that disability offers an insight into that real interdependence of everyone, disabled or not. The dependencies of disabled people only seem unusual because the needs for sign language or captioning, the need for a ramp or somewhere to have a rest if you're fatigued, are highlighted as anomalous, while needing a car to get to work or needing someone to come and fix your internet is not. I think that many people do actually recognize this in the intuition that being in control of absolutely everything isn't always a desirable thing. It's hard to put into words why, yet this intuition is strong and it's persistent. In 25 years as an empirical bioethicist, which basically means going out and listening to people, particularly people talking about the ethics of prenatal selection, I've interviewed many, I think probably hundreds of individuals. Lots of them have told me how much they value the foreknowledge and possibilities of choice that prenatal screening offer them. But others say they'd really rather not know. And they say that they're glad that they had their children before prenatal testing was widely available, because for them, the decision would either have been impossibly difficult to make or simply not an appropriate decision for them to make. So there are important questions here for society as a whole about whether increasing control over every area of life is necessarily something we should be aiming for. For Quakers, I think it warrants particularly reflection in view of our testimony of simplicity. It might be that this testimony calls us to take another dissident stance by consciously letting go of at least part of our attempts to control the kinds of bodies that people have, or the kind of people who come to occupy the world. Clearly, this doesn't mean lurching to the opposite extreme of radical powerlessness, giving up all attempts of control. If I attempted to give up, fail to control my body's attempts to reject my donor liver, I would not be standing here talking to you this evening. So how do we find this sort of Goldilocks point in between just enough control or just enough vulnerability, but not too much of either? Rejecting, or at least becoming skeptical about the ideal of independence, has something important to say about community. A flourishing and sustainable community has to vary biologically, and I'm happy to talk more about that on another occasion, but also socially. To put it in theological terms, God's purpose is achieved not through reaching some kind of ideal state or form, but through sort of constant motion, tumbling, shifting of creation. The real test of community is how we live with others whose lives appear to be very different from our own. I'm going to stick my neck out here and say that here in Australia, we are quite good at overtly and loudly celebrating diversity as an idea, particularly when it doesn't take much effort or cost much money. In the past, the responses of religious communities, and not just within the Christian tradition, to anyone seen as other have been, frankly, disappointing. Even today, people with disability are still told that they could be healed if only their faith were great enough, with the implication that those who are still disabled must be lacking in faith somewhere. Or conversely, that their illness or disability is proof that God has specially selected them because of their greater than usual faith. Or that they provide an opportunity for other faith group members to show compassion, like a kind of audiovisual aid. Or that their experience gives them unique spiritual wisdom. Or failing all else, that they'll be compensated for their suffering in this world, in the world to come. None of these, I would suggest, is likely to make disabled friends feel like equal and valued and welcome members of the meeting. And certainly not if our lives as disabled people are ostentatiously celebrated, but we still find ourselves excluded because the modifications we need for access to the world are not provided. Throughout this lecture and the book, we're coming close to the end, don't worry. Throughout this lecture and the book, you'll have noticed I raise a lot of questions without actually answering any of them. And this is because bioethicists are often expected to provide definitive guidance on morally troubling medical issues. In practice, we're not particularly good at it. I don't see it as my job to provide solutions. I see it as my role to use my skills of analysis to ask question after question about what's going on in a situation of moral trouble, to tease apart the various threads in an ethical tangle, to try to see where the real problem lies, because I think that this greater clarity and greater understanding will ultimately lead the way to better solutions, not necessarily simpler solutions, but better solutions. Moreover, when it comes to something like disability that affects so many people, potentially everyone, it just isn't appropriate for a single bioethicist to sort of have a bit of a think and then tell everybody else what to do. And my experience with Quakers over decades has been that they're quite resistant to being told what to do or told what to think. There needs to be deep and thoughtful discussion across every part of every community, each bringing their own experiences and perspectives. Within the Religious Society of Friends, our focus should be on discerning the Spirit's guidance on how to embed justice and equality for disabled people inside and beyond our own community and in a rapidly changing global context. I've been suggesting that to engage better with disability, we need to think not just differently, but dissidently, as Quakers have historically shown themselves more than able to do. Dissident isn't about being contrary for the sake of it. It's an effort to abandon the reflexes of thought and belief that get in the way of true discernment. A dissident approach is a very deliberate and considered attempt to challenge those things that have long been taken for granted. In this context, for example, that disability is easily distinguished from other kinds of difference, from normal variation, or that there is an objective standard of normality, or that disability invariably involves suffering, or that disabled people are always burdens or always to be pitied. At the start of the published version of this lecture, I quote the theologian Jenny Weiss-Block saying, "Disability is a dramatic reminder that God's ways are not our ways." And it may be that thinking dissidently about disability will open up for us some insight into the peculiarities of God's ways. Dissident thinking, as I've said, includes being open to new light from whatever source it may come. But being open doesn't mean accepting that light uncritically, whether it's scientific research or spiritual insight, or the experiences of disabled people, or the random thoughts of a Quaker bioethicist. It also means being prepared, if necessary, to stand aside from the phrases and models or even entire ideologies that are currently in fashion, even those that at first sight appear to be progressive or appear to align with what we already think. If they prove unhelpful in guiding us towards better understanding and a more just and equitable society. And such discernment is hard. It can be an individual process, but I think it's generally best done in community. So in building a community and a world that is truly inclusive of difference and as fair as possible to all its members, sometimes competing rights and needs, we shouldn't expect to find immediate unity or clarity. People with disability themselves don't share one view on contentious issues like prenatal selection or voluntary assisted dying, or even the spiritual meaning of vulnerability and fragility. Fundamentally, disability and difference just are complex and nuanced phenomena. And our only hope for properly understanding them is to include multiple perspectives, not just the ones we happen to agree with, and to be prepared to change our minds if we're going to follow where the light is leading. So thank you, friends, for your attention this evening. And I hope we can pick up the conversation tomorrow and in subsequent days.
Thank you very much for joining us in the room and online. And this brings to a close our evening, except for refreshments, a tea and coffee, and no doubt some discussion. Thank you, friends.